It's the end of the last ice age. Our ancestors have survived this freezing desolation for 25,000 years. They are hunter-gatherers. They travel light, their children with them, one meal away from starvation. They are never able to settle down. But these nomads are about to change the world. Their Stone Age revolution will make our civilization possible. They will set humanity on the long journey to the modern world. The glaciers melted, and with water, the world came back to life. One of the best places for humans to live now was an area of the Middle East we call the Fertile Crescent, from Israel to Iraq. The hills were dotted with trees, which spread quickly as the weather improved. The open woodlands were like a garden, supporting a new range of edible plants. Animals flourished on the uplands and fertile plains. It was a hunter-gatherer's paradise. It was here that travelling bands found something completely new, which would change humanity forever. They discovered a huge family of plants, the grasses. It was a vast supply of grain. This was the spark which would make human progress possible. Archaeologists estimate there were no more than 1,000 families living in the whole of Israel and Jordan at the time. There was enough grain to feed them well, and it was all growing wild.
Now, archaeologists have experimented in harvesting wild cereals in their natural area in the Middle East. And what they found is that one person harvesting for a period of about 3 weeks can produce enough food to feed a family of 4 for a whole year.
These ancient grasses are the forerunners of modern crops. The grains discovered by the Natufians still feed more than half the world's population today. Of all the things they ate, grain was unique in one vital way. It did not decay. Keep it dry, and it lasts for decades. For the first time, they had food they could rely on for long periods of time. Now, they needed to store their grain. There was a reason to stay in one place. Hunting was a dangerous way of life. They were vulnerable to injury, and their weapons were fragile. Their campsites show they worked constantly on repairs and making new tools. Like all Stone Age people, they relied on flint. By splintering different stones in the right way, they created an amazing range of specialized blades and axes. They had their own toolkits, which were precious and vital for survival.
We were digging out these houses in square metres, and every so often we'd come across an extraordinary set of tools just stacked up where they were, left 12,000 years ago. And it was so clustered, it looked as if it had been in some kind of bag. which had been placed down there and never picked up again.
In the bag were 7 smooth, round river stones, almost certainly for use in a slingshot. A piece of flint, and struck from it, a group of small spear blades called lunets. Some gazelle toe bones, raw materials for more tools and artworks. And a sickle, its handle made from antler horn, fitted with rose-coloured flint. Here, the Natufian hunter takes technology one step further. This sickle's double-bladed for added efficiency.
It was all of the things that characterise the Natufian way of hunting and gathering. The sickle for harvesting, the spearheads for hunting, the smooth stones, possibly sling stones, and then their preoccupation with ornaments made from the gazelle toe bones, which they made into beads. You can see the shape, almost perfectly circular, lovely beveled rims, beautiful footed stands, and even thicknesses of the vessels all the way through. There's been many hours of careful work put into producing these things, and doing so to, once again, a high aesthetic standard that goes perhaps beyond the immediate needs of a piece of rock to pound a pestle into to grind up seeds.
The most amazing thing about these mortars is their sheer size. They were far too heavy to carry around. We know the Natufians left them year after year at their own hearths. They are beginning to settle down near their own food supply. These early varieties of grain did not allow them to turn the flour into bread. Instead, a coarse biscuit combined different grains. A kind of pancake was the ancestor of today's flatbread. Skilled processing meant their teeth were not worn away by the coarse grain. They seem to have been clever about storage, although all the evidence has decayed. We know hollow gourds grew in the area, and they understood how to tan leather. The stored food must have been a treasure. It was a chance to share and celebrate and keep the clan together. It meant they could plan ahead and rely on the future. But stored grain was not enough to guarantee survival. The Natufians needed to combine their grain with seasonal foods like berries and nuts. They were instinctively creating a balanced diet. Fruit and vegetables with meat and starch. Inadvertently, they were directing the future evolution of plants, choosing the best, the biggest, the sweetest to carry home. It was the seeds of these carefully selected foods that ended up in the rubbish pile. The refuse was moist and organically rich, rather like a garden bed. The plants would sprout and cross-pollinate to create a more useful strain. These were the first experimental gardens. The Natufians were on the move all the time. In many ways, they had the best of the settled and the nomadic. We know from hunter-gatherers still living today in Africa and Australia that the lifestyle created leisure. Particularly in the hot sun, the community probably came together. Archaeologists guess it was an intensely shared world based on giving rather than individual wealth. We know nothing about their social structure. In modern hunter-gatherers, this is often extremely complex, regulating small groups that relied on each other with almost no privacy. But we do know these bands met together as part of a larger culture. They traded or shared prized materials which helped to maintain a network of extended kin. This trade kept the wider Natufian culture together. It enabled their tools to travel throughout the region. They were experimenting with the beginnings of commerce. What's more, they swapped ideas, new tools, new decorations, and foods. But these meetings between clans had an even more fundamental purpose. Biological survival demanded they bring back new blood to the settlement. With permanent buildings, the Natufian world was changing. Increasingly, they must have thought of themselves as coming from this valley and this cluster of huts. Their rituals and beliefs are gone, with hardly a trace of evidence. But we know they had a ceremony which linked the death of someone special to their home. They dug a hole in the floor under the fireplace, and there they buried the dead. They made it a sacred place. They brought in a huge river stone and placed it in the grave, on top of the body. With the dead buried under the foundations, the huts took on a new meaning. They repaired them regularly. In these safe places, individual possessions could be secure. Here, people could make and keep ornaments and other personal possessions. The Natufian way of life continued for 2,500 years. Then suddenly, in less than 10 years, it all came to an end. The glaciers returned to Europe, trapping the Earth's fresh water in ice. The rest of the world became colder and drier. Scientists call this short ice age the Younger Dryas. The Natufians were forced to abandon their settlements forever. Clans splintered into small groups, ranging desperately, nomadically, for food. Many perished. Then, the Natufians were offered one slim chance of survival. The drying Great Lake in Jordan exposed a fertile plain. It was here, on the shores of today's Lake Galilee, that a few Natufian refugees attempted to survive. Water, high in the hills, fed just a handful of natural springs that kept this new land moist and fertile. Now, the Natufians faced a profound challenge. They had abundant water, but these oases were very different from the rangelands and spaces they knew. What happens now is pieced together from the evidence of a number of sites in the Jordan Valley. It is a triumph of human adaptability. They knew this could never be a natural site for the huge grass colonies they once depended on. So they created their own miniature, controlled landscape. They dug the ground. They took their own precious food stocks and sacrificed them for the future. This simple act was the beginning of a new way of life. It would ultimately transform the face of the earth. They were the world's first farmers. Without knowing it, these early farmers at Zad were taking charge of evolution. They were mimicking natural selection and creating the first domesticated varieties.
One way in which the first cultivators may have selected would be by taking plants, which may have come from quite a long way away, and planting them and building up a population. Now they would choose, for example, a type of wheat which had a particularly large grain, which would give a high yield, or a barley which had, I don't know, a nice taste or something like that. And they bring these in and build up the population.
Early gardeners began influencing the shape, size and structure of the grain, what scientists call their morphology. Over time, they made it much easier to harvest.
The main difference between domesticated cereals and wild cereals is in the morphology of the ear. Wild cereals lose their grains at maturity, they fall to the ground. In the domesticated cereals, the ear stays intact. And in fact, it waits for the harvester to come along and gather them.
Cereal grains took many hundreds of years to change from their old, smaller ancestors to the bulging heads we recognize today. The first farmers still relied on hunting. The country around Zad was arid, and game was becoming scarce. They needed to improve the odds of hunting to bring down faster game at a distance. So they invented the bow and arrow. Perhaps they used it in human conflict, but there's not enough evidence to tell. Like their Natufian forebears, they buried their dead under the floor. Then they opened the graves and removed the dried skulls. They brought their ancestors back into the world. The skull remained undisturbed in this position until it was excavated by the team at Zad. The stones sometimes reveal something extraordinary. Inscribed drawings or pictographs. The scratched lines mark a quantity. This may be the first known record of a number. The biggest change created by farming is more children. A family could now feed lots of babies. After all, many hands make light work. For hunter-gatherers, it was just the opposite. They had to carry their small children on long treks. They had no more than they could manage. Now, farming families could support several generations to give the community a storehouse of wisdom.
But what is inherent in an agricultural society is the number of kids that with this kind of food, you have an increasing number of kids.
Inevitably, populations grew. More people, more farming, more food, more people. Humans were living on a larger scale than ever before. It was a huge challenge. People had to be organized. Now, they needed leaders.
Once you have one biological viable entity living in one village, say 300-400 people living in the village, which means about, say, 100 families, and they don't move, there is naturally someone is going to become a chief, right? So you have the beginning of the emergence of social institutions, having the elders and maybe having a chief, maybe a shaman. And
Families were giving part of their own harvest to a single group granary. Humans had taken a breathtaking step. Our families and clans were united into large organized communities. We were now living in societies with leaders. Across the vast expanse of Europe 9,000 years ago, a great forest stretched from the Black Sea to the coast of Brittany. Here, people still lived as they always had, hunting and gathering wild food, moving from place to place. Eventually, the revolution that began in the Fertile Crescent would spread across the rest of the world. Nearly all our ancestors would take up farming. But for most, it would not happen for many thousands of years.